Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me spend some time with you today. I do appreciate it. And I appreciate it when you hit those like, share, subscribe button things, all the good things you do when you want to let people know you've been listening. And don't be afraid to comment. I don't mind. I don't mind. Get some interesting messages, but I don't mind when you comment. Oh, by the way, before I forget, books are available at authorjerrymitchell.com, or you can go to givegod90.com and follow the link from there. When I talk about the difference between traditions and the doctrines that man has created, a lot of times I take some time and I explain where those traditions come from, why we accept them, and then I go on to showing how some of those traditions conflict with what's in the Bible. And quite often I'm asked, why did we start? How did we get to the point? How did we get to where we are today? And the short answer is, of course, found in Jeremiah 16:19. We have inherited the lies of our fathers. That's the short answer. But if we really start to dig, we find that the real reason that a lot of people believe the things we do that conflict with the Bible is that the very first person to come up with an idea or come up with a fact or come up with what they thought was a fact, come up with a concept, they didn't have or they didn't use all of the real facts that they had available. It's that simple. Let me use this example. For a very long time after the flood of Moses, just about every culture, every civilization all over the world, they believed that some god or some gods, plural, created everything that's around. They controlled the weather, they controlled the sun, the moon, the stars, all of that. And for the purpose of what I'm going to talk about, it's not important to know which gods or that kind of thing. It's just that people all over the world accepted and understood the notion that something created the earth we live on. It just didn't happen because it did, right? Most of those people that migrated out of the land of Shinar after the fall of the tower, they had understood, they had heard, and through several generations, it was confused. The language was confused, so they didn't really quite know how to express that belief as one anymore, right? So they just kind of took that with them, that knowledge with them that, well, God created the earth, God flooded the earth, God started over with, just a few people aboard an ark. And from that, just about every invention, every improvement to that ancient technology, if you want to call it that, all of that through history was based on an understanding that worked with creation, not against it. Think about this. And when Isaac Newton wrote down what we think of as the laws of gravity, what he was actually writing is what he observed. He was watching creation at work, so he writes down what he observes in a mathematical formula. And Newton was first a theologian, but he was a gifted and brilliant mathematician. He was a physicist. He was an astronomer. He was also an alchemist. But he observed creation at work, and that is what his work was based in. That's what his work founded in, how creation works. He didn't write anything that worked against creation whatsoever. That came later, well, around the same time, kinda. It was in the late 16th, early 17th centuries that the scientists began to consider what, you know, what if it wasn't God or gods that created the earth? What if it wasn't, some supernatural thing that did this? What if it just happened? They call this the age of enlightenment or the age of reason. Um, I don't know how enlightened they were if they started thinking, well, it couldn't have been God. That's just a fairy tale, right? They no longer considered the Bible as a historical account. They reduced it to nothing more than some poetic literature. It's a book of fairy tales, right? Well, no, I won't agree with it's a book of fairy tales. I'll agree it's a book of history, but fairy tales, no. And about the same time that all of this was happening, man was traveling more. They were going places. Um, they were writing letters of correspondence back and forth. These scientists were talking to each other. They would pass on their ideas and share their ideas with anybody who would listen, kind of like people do today, right? There's not a lot of difference. But about this same time, sorta, and I'm giving it a couple of hundred years here, right? So about the same time, when I'm talking about this, it takes time for these things to develop. But about this same time, the British Empire, it was expanding. They heard about, scientists heard about the pyramids. Let's go see them. How'd they build them? How they do this? How they do that? And and they go down and they're talking to the people and they're looking, but their early methods of archaeology wasn't real perfect. It just wasn't real perfect. Like a lot of things, right? Certainly a hammer made out of iron is better than a hammer made out of rock for most things. Now, there are some things that certain rocks and minerals outperform depending on what you're doing. But that's a different story. They found things and they looked at it and they wondered what it was, how it would have been used, that kind of thing. They heard the legends and the traditions of the people that were living in Egypt at the time. And then they added their own influences, right? We're from a civilized culture. This must have been a really backwards way of doing things. You know how it is, right? We do the same thing today when we're talking about people 100 years ago. It's just human nature, I guess. But they were lacking real history. They looked at the hieroglyphs and they came up with a way to decipher these hieroglyphs, and they kind of changed some of the things they were thinking. Well, maybe it's this way and not that way, that kind of thing. But they never included or considered the Bible as a historical account of Egypt, even though Egypt is mentioned often in the Bible. After all, it's nothing but a book of fairy tales and poetry. That's all it is to them. Well, they took their ideas, they shared their ideas, they began to teach their ideas in the universities and colleges and to anybody that would listen to them. And before long, their ideas and their concepts, no matter if they were right or wrong, they became fact because some scientists said so, not because the historical documents verified it, simply because somebody came up with an idea and said, this must be what it means. And, even today, and I've talked to people about this, even today, if you have an opinion that is different from what these, and I'll say Egyptologists, if you have an opinion that's different, you're considered a heretic among that secular group. And then, of course, later, we had Darwin, his theory of evolution, in his famous book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Most people don't realize that it was the removing of our creator and replacing him with evolution that actually helped introduce racism, because it drove a wedge between people based on the color of their skin. That's what evolution did to humanity. And then a funny thing happened on the way to the future. The more mankind tried to deny or reject the creator, the more our creator began to reveal his evidence, the witnesses that he left right there in the Middle East. If you look in Egypt, the storehouses that Joseph had built were located. And then, the reason behind the names of certain places and things in Egypt were found. The canals, the waterways that Joseph had constructed. If you look in Saudi Arabia, the evidence, witnesses there that the mixed multitude were actually in the land of Midian, not on the Sinai Peninsula. All these things are there. And throughout the Middle East, clay tablets, small metal scrolls, they're witnesses of biblical history. They're telling us the history in the Bible is the history of mankind. Secular scientific facts, and I use that term very loosely, they're being overturned almost every month. And not always by scientists, right? And that's the big reason they are fighting so hard against these discoveries. Oh, it can't be that way because our books, our textbooks tell us this. You see, our Creator is doing exactly what he's always done. He is revealing himself to the average person. And he's using those who are willing to follow him to show who he really is. And the funny part, the funny thing happened on the way to the future, is he's using the arrogance of the scientists, the secular scientists, to publicize the things he's revealing to the humble people. You see, if the average humble person wasn't coming up with these, wasn't finding these things, after all, who was it that found the scrolls in a cave in Qumran? The Dead Sea Scrolls? It wasn't a scientist. It was a group of kids. He's using these very people who reject him to show the world the witnesses that he's left. To show the world he's working. He is the Creator. Now, Paul had some very good advice to offer Timothy when he wrote in his first letter, reject irreverent, silly myths. Instead, train yourself for godliness. He's saying, look, don't listen to all the self-proclaimed experts, right? Because they don't know what they're talking about. You study your scripture. And long before Paul, our Creator warns us over and over against falling for those who would lead us away from the Creator. Jeremiah 29:8. For this is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says, do not be deceived by the prophets and diviners among you, and do not listen to the dreams you elicit from them. Don't listen to the people who don't know what they're talking about. They might sound good. Their ideas might make you stop and think, could that happen? And even today, where we are right now, there are religious traditions and doctrines that conflict with the Bible, right? And when those traditions and doctrines are pointed out to Christians, to Jews, doesn't matter. What do? They argue in favor of the traditions. They argue in favor of their doctrines that replace or conflict what's actually written in the Bible. they're no different than the secular scientists arguing with with the witnesses that our Creator is revealing. Over 100 times in the Bible, we're warned against deception from many, many different sources. Yeah, a funny thing is happening on our way to the future. Our Creator is really not so quietly working to show us He is the one who created everything. And I think He's getting more loud and more pronounced about it, right? He's out there and he's saying, look at this. You need to see this. You need to understand what you're looking at. You need to have all the facts. You need to use all the information that's available to you. And when you do, you see what he's doing. So, the next time you hear or read about a new discovery, ask yourself, how's our Creator using this to show us who he is? Because when we look at it through that point of view, you get something different than what some of the secular folks might be pushing. We don't need proof that our Creator or that the Bible is true. Creation itself is the witness. All of these discoveries are basically collaborating witnesses, right? They're witnesses to something that should be obvious and was obvious to all of those ancient civilizations because they were right about one thing. Our Creator did make the heavens and the earth. There's no doubt about that. The doubt comes from the people who reject him. The doubt comes from the people who discard him. The doubt comes from the people who say, maybe it all just happened. Something to think about until next time. And until then, I do wish you many, many blessings, everyone.